The Galactic Empire spanned thousands of star systems, its rule absolute, its conquests effortless. For centuries, no species had challenged its dominance. Every civilization that resisted fell swiftly, crushed beneath the weight of superior numbers and technology. And then, they found humanity. At first, humans intrigued the Empire. Unlike other species, they lacked a centralized planetary government. Instead, they were fragmented, nations competing against one another, waging wars even among themselves. The imperial strategists studied Earth's history, examining its wars, its diplomacy, its patterns of conflict. What they saw led them to a conclusion: humans were inherently afraid of war. Unlike the blood-soaked histories of warrior species the Empire had conquered, humanity's wars were short, often fought with hesitation. They built weapons of destruction but feared using them. They sought peace even when victory was within their grasp. To the Empire, this was a weakness. The assessment was finalized: Category E, pacifist species. Militarily insignificant. Conquering them would be as easy as annexing a defenseless moon. The Empire made its move. They bypassed Earth, instead targeting its outer colonies. A newly established settlement, New Montana, became the first target. A pristine world, rich in resources, lightly defended. The invasion fleet arrived in orbit, broadcasting a single message: submit to the Empire, and no harm will come to you. No response. The Empire took this as confirmation of fear. They landed their troops, expecting immediate surrender. They encountered no resistance at first, just silence. Cities stood abandoned, streets empty. The humans had fled, they assumed. A species too afraid to fight. That assumption shattered when the first patrol vanished. A squad of elite Imperial soldiers entered a human outpost. They never returned. Their last transmission contained only garbled screams and gunfire. Reinforcements found them hours later, ambushed, executed, and displayed as a warning. The bodies were mutilated, dog tags missing, helmets crushed. A single human phrase was carved into a metallic surface nearby: "Come and take it." The Empire dismissed it as an anomaly. A desperate act by a few defiant settlers. They deployed more troops, sent mechanized walkers to flush out resistance. But the deeper they pushed into human territory, the worse it became. First, it was the snipers, silent, patient, precise. Imperial officers were shot mid-command, their bodies hitting the ground before their troops even registered the sound. Then, supply lines were cut overnight, convoys destroyed, rations burned, comms disrupted. Troops stationed at outposts vanished without a trace. Panic spread through the ranks. The Empire had expected a battle, not a hunt, but that's what it became. The hunters were not the Imperials. The humans were. It wasn't just soldiers, either. Civilians fought. Farmers became saboteurs. Miners turned tunnels into death traps. Even unarmed settlers carried makeshift explosives, choosing to die taking Imperials with them. The Empire's confidence cracked. This wasn't cowardice. This was something else. Then, the reinforcements arrived, not from Earth, but from the United States. The American forces didn't bring peace talks. They brought war. And the Empire was about to learn that humans weren't afraid of war. They were made for it. The first sign of true terror for the Empire came when their forward command post was reduced to silence. No distress call, no alarm, just dead air. When scouts arrived, they found the entire base wiped out. Not destroyed by orbital bombardment or overwhelming force. No, this was precise. Calculated. Bodies were found with single bullet wounds to the head or throat. Equipment had been stripped, comms destroyed. The attack had been surgical, executed with such efficiency that not a single alarm had been triggered. Then, the recordings surfaced. Captured Imperial soldiers were forced to transmit a message back to their command. They are not afraid. They are killers. The Americans had arrived. Imperial strategists scrambled for answers. The humans had no business being this effective. Their fleet was outnumbered, their ground forces smaller, yet they fought as if war was their element. The Empire, for all its size, had fought predictable wars, sweeping conquests against lesser forces. The Americans were something else entirely. They didn't fight by the rules. Imperial troops relied on formations, structured battle plans, and centralized command. The Americans. They adapted. There was no pattern to exploit. No hesitation. When they attacked, they didn't just engage in firefights, they hunted. Strike teams infiltrated enemy positions, planting explosives in supply caches, hijacking Imperial communications, feeding them false orders, leading entire battalions into kill zones. Nothing was off-limits. Imperial officers found their personal quarters raided, classified data stolen, encrypted files already cracked before they even knew they were compromised. Prisoners were taken, interrogated, and then released, not out of mercy, but to spread terror among their ranks. The Empire attempted to regain control. They deployed elite shock troops, warriors bred for combat, trained since birth to be unshakable. The Americans cut them down before they could even fire their weapons. Snipers. Invisible. Bombers. Intercepted before deployment. Heavy armor. Turned to scrap metal with portable anti-tank weapons. The Empire thought they were facing soldiers. They weren't. They were facing warriors who had spent generations mastering the art of combat. Men and women whose ancestors had fought wars on Earth so brutal that survival meant learning to win at any cost. The Empire fought for expansion. Americans fought for something else. Victory. At any price. It wasn't just brute force. It was strategy, deception, raw human ingenuity. The Empire had more ships, more soldiers, more resources, but it didn't matter. Because against the Americans, numbers didn't guarantee survival. There was a moment, a defining shift, when the Empire realized the truth. It came when an entire Imperial battalion surrendered, not because they lacked weapons, not because they lacked reinforcements, but because they were too afraid to fight. The reason? They had been left in the dark for 3 days. No supply drops. No communication. No leadership. Just the sound of something moving in the night, unseen, whispering in a language they didn't understand. Their own men went missing, one by one, until finally they broke. The last transmission from the captured Imperial commander was simple. A plea. We underestimated them. We thought them weak. We were wrong. By then, it was too late. The Americans were just getting started. The Empire refused to accept reality. They believed the losses were an anomaly, that the Americans had simply caught them off guard. Arrogance still clouded their judgment. A proper response, they thought, would end this defiance. They assembled a crack force, the finest warriors their empire had ever produced. Battle-hardened veterans, armed with the most advanced weaponry, led by generals who had crushed dozens of rebellions. They descended upon New Montana, confident that this time, victory was inevitable. The Americans didn't dig in. They didn't defend in the way the Empire expected. There were no static lines, no grand last stand. Instead, they let the Imperials come, and then they broke them from within. The battle didn't start with gunfire. It started with silence. Supply depots vanished overnight, detonated with explosives or stripped clean. Convoys never arrived, either rerouted by false orders or ambushed and left to burn. Airfields became useless as bombers were destroyed before they could take off. Command stations went dark, their officers assassinated in their sleep. The Americans fought in shadows, striking fast and fading away before the Empire could respond. Desperation set in. The Imperial soldiers, once proud and disciplined, started falling apart. Sleep deprivation took its toll. Every rustling wind, every shadow in the corner of their vision felt like an attack. They fired at nothing, wasted ammunition on ghosts. Fear became their real enemy. Then the broadcasts began. American forces hacked into Imperial communications, flooding their channels with chilling messages. Some were taunts, distorted voices whispering in their language. Others were recordings of their captured soldiers begging for mercy, except they weren't begging to the Americans. They were begging for the Empire to save them. But no rescue came. In one night, the largest Imperial outpost on New Montana fell without a single bullet fired. The soldiers inside, over 5,000 of them, were found in the morning, gone. Their weapons left behind, their vehicles untouched. No bodies. Just empty uniforms scattered across the floor, as if their owners had vanished into thin air. The survivors, those who were left, spoke of horrors that made no sense. The sounds of footsteps right outside their barracks, but no one was ever there. Comms whispering their own names back at them, though no one had spoken. Entire patrols returning to camp only to find it abandoned, their comrades missing, footprints leading out into the darkness, never back. The few who made it off-world refused to speak. Some wouldn't even eat, convinced their food had been poisoned. Others gouged their own eyes out, screaming that they could still see them watching. Imperial High Command could no longer deny the truth. The Americans weren't just winning. They weren't just fighting. They were destroying the will to resist. The Empire made one last attempt to turn the tide. They gathered everything they had, an armada of ships, a full-scale planetary invasion force. The order was simple: crush the Americans by any means necessary. No mercy. No restraint. The fleet never made it. As they reached orbit, their navigation systems failed, their comms jammed. Some ships turned on each other, gunners firing on their own allies, convinced they had been infiltrated. Others lost control entirely, crashing into each other, into the planet, or simply vanishing into the void. And then, the American response arrived. Not a counterattack. Not a retreat. Just one simple message broadcasted to every Imperial soldier still alive. You are never safe. At that moment, the war was already over. The only question was how long the Empire could survive the aftermath. The Emperor could no longer ignore the truth. His forces were in complete disarray. Entire battalions had vanished. His best commanders were either dead or too afraid to fight. His fleets were crippled, his supply lines in shambles. He had seen rebellions before, but this was different. This was annihilation. He sent a transmission to Earth, offering a ceasefire. The Americans didn't respond. Days passed. The silence was deafening. Then came the news: an American strike force had bypassed the front lines entirely. They had taken the war to the Empire's heart. The Imperial homeworld, a fortress never breached in thousands of years, fell overnight. Not to a planetary invasion, not to orbital bombardments, but to precision. Government buildings infiltrated and cleared, military leadership wiped out, the Emperor's own palace breached without a single alarm being triggered. By the time the Imperial fleet received the distress call, it was already over. Their leaders were dead, their systems compromised, their command structure erased. The last standing members of the Imperial Council, now leaderless and terrified, begged for terms. The Americans did not demand tribute. They did not seek to enslave or conquer. They had no interest in ruling an empire. They had one demand: unconditional surrender. The empire collapsed within days, not years. Without leadership, their territories fractured. Former vassal states broke away, unwilling to fight a war they now knew they could never win. Some attempted to resist, none succeeded. The name America spread across the galaxy, not as conquerors, not as tyrants, but as something far worse. A force that no one dared provoke. The surviving Imperial officers who had fought on New Montana never spoke of what they had seen. Some retired in silence. Others disappeared. A few were found dead by their own hands, unable to live with the memories. Years later, in a remote bar on a distant world, an old Imperial veteran was asked about the war. He had fought against the humans, had seen them firsthand. The man questioning him was young, ambitious, still believing the myths of Imperial supremacy. The veteran simply shook his head, eyes haunted. "We thought them weak," he whispered. "We thought them afraid. But we only saw their diplomats. We never saw their warriors. Until it was too late."